The airport was a chaotic blend of rolling suitcases, business travelers, and families dragging tired children through the crowds. Colonel David Carter stepped through the bustling terminal, his polished dress shoes clicking against the tile floor. He had been here before, many times, but today was different. Today, the weight on his chest wasn't just from the ribbons on his uniform. It was from the casket on the tarmac, draped with the American flag. The remains of Private First Class Jason Reynolds, a young man of 21, were waiting to be escorted home, and it was Carter's responsibility to make sure he made it. Carter straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and approached the airline counter. He placed his military orders and ID on the desk, his fingers steady despite the gravity of the situation. The woman behind the desk barely glanced at him at first, too focused on typing something into her computer. But when she looked up, her expression changed. The pause was brief, but it was enough. She frowned and glanced at her colleague. Carter's eyes narrowed. He knew something was off. "Sir, could I see your papers again?" she asked, her voice tight. He handed them over without a word, watching her carefully. She hesitated, and for the first time, he saw fear flicker in her eyes. She whispered something to a coworker, who gave her a look that said this is a problem. The woman returned with a weak smile, her face pale. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be an issue with your ticket. We can't allow you to board at this time." Carter's jaw tightened, his gaze unwavering. He had escorted remains before. This wasn't his first time, and he knew the procedure. This was supposed to be a routine task, one that, in his mind, didn't require explanation. But now, standing before him, was a wall, and he wasn't about to back down. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier," Carter said, his voice steady. "The paperwork is all in order. Everything checks out." The woman didn't meet his eyes. "I understand, sir, but there's a security protocol in place. I can't override it." "Security protocol," Carter repeated, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "What protocol?" She forced another smile, but it was clear she was losing control of the situation. "I'm sorry, sir. It's just policy." A murmur spread behind him as passengers in line began to notice. Carter felt the weight of their eyes, but he didn't move. He didn't flinch. No one gets left behind, he reminded himself. Not even in this airport. Not today. "I need to understand exactly what the issue is," Carter insisted, his voice calm, but his words precise. "This is a military assignment, not a personal trip. My documentation is valid. So, what's the real reason I'm being denied?" The woman faltered, her gaze flicking nervously toward her coworker. A man in his 50s, with a tired look about him, stepped forward. The supervisor. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, his voice polished, professional, but something about the way he spoke told Carter that he wasn't going to get any answers today. "We have certain policies in place, and unfortunately, we can't override them at this time." "Policy," Carter repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, but it was enough to carry the weight of 100 questions. The line behind him was growing, and the whispers were starting to rise. People were starting to take notice of the military man in full-dress uniform being denied passage. But Carter didn't move. Instead, he stood firm, waiting for an explanation that didn't feel like an excuse. "I've flown with military escorts before," Carter said. "I know the procedure, and I know there's no policy stopping me from boarding. So, let's be honest. What's really going on?" The supervisor cleared his throat, shifting his weight nervously. "It's just an extra security measure, sir," he said. "Nothing personal." "Nothing personal," Carter echoed, his jaw tightening. It didn't feel personal to the airline, but it sure felt personal to him. He was here to honor a fallen soldier, not to be put through bureaucratic nonsense. Behind him, the murmurs grew louder. People were noticing. Some started pulling out their phones, recording, watching. Just then, A voice cut through the growing tension. "Sir, do you have an issue with his military clearance?" Carter turned. A man in his 60s, wearing a USMC hat and looking every bit the part of a seasoned veteran, had spoken up from somewhere behind him. Carter didn't answer, but the man's words had hit the mark. The supervisor stiffened. "No, sir, this is not about clearance," he said quickly, trying to steer the conversation away. "It's just protocol." The Marine's eyes narrowed. "I've been through security 1,000 times. I've never seen protocol stop a soldier from escorting one of our own home," he said, his voice calm but firm. "So, what is it?" The crowd was growing restless now. Phones were out, cameras recording, and the air in the terminal grew thick with tension. Passengers were no longer just waiting for their flights. They were watching, waiting to see how this would unfold. The stakes had just gotten a lot higher. The airline employees looked increasingly uncomfortable, exchanging glances, but they stood their ground. Carter wasn't going anywhere without answers, but neither was the story. Then, a young woman, no older than 25, stepped forward, her phone in hand. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was a determined edge to her voice. "I don't mean to intrude," she said carefully, "but I just want to make sure I understand. They are not letting you board." Carter turned to face her. He didn't need to answer, because the truth was in his eyes. "That's right," he said evenly. She blinked, her eyes widening as if she hadn't expected this answer. Then, without another word, she turned the phone toward him. "I'm live right now," she said. "People need to see this." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Phones were raised, recording the scene. The whispers grew into voices, and the energy in the terminal shifted. People were no longer just passengers. They were witnesses. The Marine stepped forward again, his voice steady. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," he said, his words carrying weight. "But I never thought I'd see the day when an American soldier, especially one escorting the remains of a brother in arms, was treated like this." The terminal went eerily silent. Every eye was on Carter. Every phone was recording. The moment stretched on, heavy with the weight of injustice. It didn't take long for the airline's mistake to become a viral sensation. Phones buzzed with notifications. Tweets began to pour in. The situation had officially gone beyond the terminal, beyond the airline's control. But Carter? He remained steady, his expression unreadable. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for the fallen, for Private First Class Jason Reynolds. And that mission was just beginning. The terminal was still humming with quiet murmurs, the weight of Colonel David Carter's stand still hanging in the air. People shifted uncomfortably, their phones now trained not just on the uniformed soldier but on the ripple effect his refusal to back down had caused. The crowd, once a random mix of travelers, had now become a collective force, their gaze fixed on Carter, their attention focused like a laser. The airline representatives were starting to look like cornered animals, trying to cover up a mistake that was no longer in their control. The supervisor, once so confident, was nowhere to be seen. Carter stood firm, his eyes never leaving the counter, waiting for the next move. It didn't take long. Out of nowhere, the air shifted again as a new figure appeared at the far end of the terminal. His sharp stride, the crispness of his military uniform, and the unmistakable aura of authority were enough to command immediate attention. Major Thomas Beckett wasn't just any officer. He was the kind of person whose presence in a room made everyone else step aside, both figuratively and literally. The crowd parted as he made his way directly to Carter. "Colonel," Major Beckett greeted, his voice firm and respectful as he extended a hand. "Major Thomas Beckett, Department of the Army." His gaze flicked to the airline staff. "We've been informed of the situation." Carter shook his hand firmly, nodding in recognition. He didn't need to ask how the major knew about the incident. The military didn't take matters like this lightly. "Major," he acknowledged. Beckett's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the still-charged atmosphere. He turned to the airline rep, who looked like he had just been summoned to the principal's office. "We're handling this now," Beckett said coolly. His voice had the kind of authority that made the rep shift uncomfortably. The rep opened his mouth to protest, but Beckett didn't give him a chance. "Colonel Carter and the remains of Private First Class Reynolds will not be flying commercial." His words hung in the air for a long moment. The rep blinked, confusion evident on his face. "Sir, we were just about to." "You were just about to cover your tracks," Beckett interrupted smoothly, never breaking eye contact. "The Pentagon has arranged for a private military flight. It's waiting for him now." A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief mixed with relief. Carter's expression remained neutral as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. No one had come to his aid because they cared about him personally. They cared because he represented something much bigger, a system that had failed to show respect but was now forced to reckon with it. The rep was trying to save face, trying to salvage what was left of the situation. But it was already too late. The damage had been done, not just to Carter's dignity, but to the airline's reputation. The major turned to Carter, his eyes softening for the first time. "We'll take care of everything from here, Colonel." Carter exhaled slowly, his shoulders slightly relaxing. This wasn't just about getting on a plane anymore. This was about sending a message. "Understood, Major." As they walked toward the exit, the sound of footsteps on the cold terminal floor seemed to echo louder than before. The Marine who had spoken up earlier gave Carter a small nod, the kind of gesture that spoke volumes. Carter nodded back, silently acknowledging the solidarity that had helped keep him grounded when the system was working against him. But the battle wasn't over yet. As they passed through the terminal, Carter could feel the weight of the eyes on him. It wasn't just the staff or the other passengers. It was everyone who had stood up, who had spoken out, who had refused to let this moment fade into the background. They had witnessed something important, a violation of respect that couldn't be ignored. And in that moment, Carter knew one thing. The real fight had only just begun. The silence that had fallen over the terminal was replaced with a quiet, heavy buzz as Major Beckett and Colonel Carter made their way toward the exit. Each step seemed to amplify the tension, the stillness of the moment now thick with expectation. People were still glued to their phones, some recording, others watching, all witnessing the quiet shift of power from the hands of the airline to the hands of those who had been wronged. The story was no longer just in the terminal. It was everywhere now, and there was no going back. As Carter stepped through the sliding doors into the cool air outside, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The casket of Private First Class Jason Reynolds was waiting, and the mission to bring him home was far from over. But the situation at the airport was far from resolved. Behind him, the airline staff scrambled. A few of the employees were still standing at the counter, looking helplessly at the crowd. One of the agents had her head buried in her hands, her posture crumpling under the weight of their collective failure. The supervisor who had tried to smooth over the situation earlier had disappeared, no doubt retreating to figure out how to save face. It was already too late. "Major, I appreciate the intervention," Carter said, his voice low but steady. He wasn't speaking just to the man beside him. He was speaking to the entire mess that had been created. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Beckett glanced at him, his eyes sharp. "We know. The Pentagon is on it. You will be taken care of from here on out. But the fallout for that airline, it's just starting." Carter nodded. He didn't need the Major to explain that to him. The ramifications of what had just unfolded were already beginning to spread far beyond the confines of the terminal. As the military van pulled up to transport Carter and the remains of Private Reynolds, the images of the incident were already making waves. News outlets were picking up the story, the headlines as blunt as they were damning. U.S. Army Colonel denied flight while escorting fallen soldiers' remains. It wasn't just the story itself. It was a reaction. Veterans, military families, and everyday citizens had seen something they couldn't ignore. And they weren't about to let it slide. In the next few hours, social media erupted. Hashtags like #LetHimFly and #RespectOurSoldiers were trending, a call to action that carried the weight of thousands of voices, all demanding accountability. People who had never met Carter or Private Reynolds were now rallying behind them. The once quiet murmurs of the terminal had turned into a chorus of outrage and support. At the same time, military advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and even public figures began weighing in. The statement from the airline, offering a weak apology and promising an investigation, felt more like an attempt at damage control than a genuine effort to make things right. But the real power of the moment was something the airline never saw coming: the public's reaction. People weren't just upset, they were disgusted. And they weren't going to let the airline sweep this under the rug. Back at the airport, the agents behind the counter were beginning to feel the pressure. The news clips were already circulating, the footage of the confrontation between Carter, the Marine, and the airline staff spreading like wildfire. The agent who had denied Carter's ticket was now being painted as the villain of the story, her face plastered across social media. It wasn't just a mistake anymore, it was a public failure, and no amount of PR spin could change that. The airline's leadership was beginning to make phone calls. In a meeting that afternoon, the CEO of the airline was forced to address the growing public backlash. His apology, though swift, felt hollow, especially as more details emerged about the incident. The CEO tried to assure the public that the situation was a misunderstanding and promised that steps would be taken to ensure something like this would never happen again. But the damage had already been done. Customers began to demand action, and fast. One by one, individuals took to social media, vowing to boycott the airline until the staff responsible were held accountable. The company's stock, which had been steadily rising for months, began to dip. By the end of the week, it had lost several percentage points. The public was not just angry, they were demanding accountability, and the airline was scrambling to keep up. But it wasn't just a financial hit. Legal action was on the horizon. Military advocacy groups began organizing, calling for a formal lawsuit against the airline for failure to uphold the protections and respect owed to service members. The language of the lawsuit was sharp and to the point: discrimination and failure to accommodate military personnel. Meanwhile, Colonel Carter was still focused on the mission at hand. He didn't care about the media frenzy. He didn't care about the lawsuit or the apology the airline was scrambling to offer. What mattered was getting Private Reynolds home, where he belonged, to his family. Inside the private military plane that would finally take them to their destination, Carter sat alone, looking out the window. The hum of the engines was a distant sound. All that mattered was the journey ahead. But even as Carter thought about the task before him, he knew the battle wasn't over. The public's outrage would continue to grow. The airline had made a dangerous miscalculation. They had underestimated the power of the people to hold institutions accountable. They had made a mistake, and now they were going to have to live with the consequences. Carter adjusted his hat, sitting straighter in his seat. The mission was still on, but the war for respect had just begun. As the private military plane soared through the night sky, the steady hum of the engines was a small comfort to Colonel Carter. He was used to silence in moments like these. It wasn't that he didn't hear the noise around him. It was just that, sometimes, the sound of duty was louder than anything else. Right now, duty was the only thing keeping him from being consumed by the weight of everything that had happened. The mission had to be completed. Private Reynolds deserved that. But the airline's disgraceful actions weren't far from his mind. The mission wasn't just about getting a fallen soldier home. It was about something bigger now. About respect. About accountability. And, whether the airline liked it or not, that was a fight that had only just begun. When the plane landed, Carter and the remains of Private Reynolds were met with the solemn presence of the young soldier's family. There were no cameras, no reporters, just the grief-stricken faces of loved ones who had lost someone far too young. And in that moment, the public outcry over the airport incident seemed distant. This was real. This was why Carter had stood his ground, why he had refused to be silenced. As the soldier's family received their son's remains, Carter stood by with quiet reverence. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. His role had been completed. The mission was done. But the airline's failures would continue to echo long after. Back in the public eye, the consequences for the airline were becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as a ripple of outrage had now become a full-blown storm. Politicians from both sides of the aisle had started to demand investigations, calling for hearings to examine how a service member could be denied their right to complete a mission. It wasn't just a corporate mistake. It had become a question of national honor. The backlash was relentless. Veterans organizations filed formal complaints, and military families took to social media, recounting their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment by the airline. The hashtag #LetHimFly had taken on a life of its own, spreading across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. News outlets ran the story on repeat, with anchors and commentators discussing the implications of what had happened. As pressure mounted, the airline found itself scrambling to control the narrative. A second round of public apologies came, but they felt hollow. The damage was done, and no apology could undo the stain that had been left on their reputation. Then came the lawsuit. A coalition of military advocacy groups filed a formal class action complaint against the airline, accusing them of discrimination, failure to honor military protocol, and defying service member protections. The case gained traction quickly. It wasn't just about the treatment of Colonel Carter. It was about how military personnel had been treated for years, often dismissed and ignored. Behind the scenes, the airline's executives were under fire. The CEO, who had once stood confidently in front of cameras, was now being called in front of congressional hearings. Shareholders began to demand accountability, some even suggesting that the airline's leadership be replaced. The financial impact was enormous. A company once seen as a staple of air travel was now viewed as a symbol of disrespect for those who served the country. As the days passed, Colonel Carter continued to focus on his duty. He didn't need to attend press conferences or sit through interviews. His job was clear. He was the one who had walked the path of duty, and he had done so with the integrity he had been trained to uphold. For him, this wasn't about the scandal. It was about ensuring that Private Reynolds was honored with the dignity he deserved, but even Carter couldn't ignore the change in the air. As the media attention intensified, his story, too, became one of national significance. He had become more than just a man performing his duty. He had become a symbol of what it meant to stand up when something was wrong. One evening, as Carter sat alone in a small office back at the base, he got a call from Major Beckett. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of pride in it. "You did it, Colonel. The country's awake now. The airline's in trouble, and they are going to be held accountable." Carter leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the night sky. The tension had finally lifted, but the lessons learned from this ordeal were deep, and they weren't ones he could easily forget. "They'll pay for their mistake," Carter said, his voice even. "But more than that, they'll remember what happens when you forget to respect those who serve." Beckett's voice softened. "I think everyone will. The real victory here is the change that's coming, Colonel. The way people will think about how they treat soldiers, about how they treat each other. You forced a reckoning." As Carter ended the call and hung up the phone, he felt a small flicker of satisfaction. But it wasn't about winning. It was about what had been achieved, about making sure that no soldier, no matter their rank or the uniform they wore, would ever again be dismissed, ignored, or denied basic respect. Not by anyone, anywhere. And that was a lesson. Respect, dignity, and honor weren't things you could buy or fake. They were earned, sometimes through sacrifice, sometimes through struggle. But when the time came to do the right thing, to stand up for what mattered, people had to act. The crowd at the airport, the ones who had recorded, spoken up, and refused to remain silent. They had made sure of that. The airline's downfall wasn't just their fault. It was everyone who had watched, everyone who had stood together, refusing to let an injustice go unnoticed. Carter looked out over the base, his mind already on the next mission, the next task to be done. But in the back of his mind, the one truth remained. Sometimes, the greatest battles weren't fought on foreign soil. They were fought in moments like these, when a single act of courage could change everything. The story of Colonel Carter, Private Reynolds, and the airline would go down in history as a reminder of what it meant to truly honor those who served. But for Carter, it was a reminder of the greater purpose he carried, to never let the silence of indifference win. As he stood up from the desk, he knew the war for respect had been won, but the fight for justice would continue. The message was clear. Respect shouldn't be conditional, and the world was finally listening.